He was not supposed to be the one who found him. Of the four cars tangled together on the final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500, Ken Schrader's was the closest, and what he saw through that window has never fully left him. For 25 years, he gave interviews, sat for documentaries, and said almost nothing about those few seconds. He answered every question around the edges of it and none about the center. Fans filled in the silence with their own theories, and most of them were wrong. Now, at 69, he has finally started talking. Not for attention, not for a paycheck, because the man he is protecting has been gone for a quarter of a century, and some truths only get heavier the longer you carry them alone. Turn 4 one last time. The cars came off turn 2 in a tight, ugly pack, 5 of them fighting for position that barely mattered anymore. Michael Waltrip and Dale Earnhardt Jr. had already broken away, running 1-2 untouchable, both driving cars owned by the man behind them. Waltrip had never won a race in over 460 career starts. This was finally going to be the day. Behind that lead pair, Ken Schrader, Dale Earnhardt, Sterling Marlin, and Rusty Wallace were fighting for a finish that would not change the outcome of the race. It would change everything else. Schrader pushed to the outside coming off the backstretch. He had raced beside Earnhardt enough times to know the move underneath never worked. That try to pass him on the bottom just meant losing momentum for nothing. Earnhardt made contact with Marlin's car first, low on the track, and his black Chevrolet shot up the banking toward the wall. Schrader, running the high line at exactly the wrong moment, could not get out of the way. His car caught Earnhardt's on the outside, and both slammed into the concrete barrier at full speed. From the broadcast booth, it barely registered compared to the violent, rolling wrecks Daytona had produced before. This looked survivable. Cars had walked away from far worse over the years, and for a moment the broadcast lingered on the celebration up front instead of the wreck behind it. Schrader climbed out his own wreck first, uninjured, and instead of checking on himself, he ran straight for the black number 3 car sitting against the wall, still smoking, still settling on its suspension. He reached the window and looked inside. There was no movement, no sound. Nothing like the driver he had known for 2 decades, the same man who had ridden shotgun with him on business trips and argued with him about fish deliveries. Schrader did not try to pull him out. He turned instead and waved frantically toward the medical crew, a gesture that said more than any word could have. He already knew. He just was not ready to say it out loud. Not that day, and not for a very long time after. Schrader was no rookie standing at that window. By that point in his career, he had already spent close to 2 decades in the sport's top series, one of the most durable and respected drivers in the garage, a man who had raced against Earnhardt more times than either of them could probably count. That mattered. It meant the person kneeling beside that wreckage was not a stranger reacting to a stranger's crash. It was someone who understood exactly what a silent cockpit at that speed usually meant, even before any doctor arrived to confirm it. What Schrader knew, and who he told first. While rescue workers surrounded car number 3, the broadcast stayed locked on victory lane. Waltrip was finally celebrating his first career win, and Earnhardt Jr. had finished second, both driving for the team owned by the man now trapped in the wreckage behind them. It should have been the greatest afternoon of Waltrip's career. Instead, it became the moment nobody who was there wanted to remember. Schrader did not head to the interview pen. He went looking for one person. He found Waltrip mid-celebration, still soaked in the moment, and pulled him aside, away from the cameras and the noise. He did not say the words out loud, not the final ones, but he told his friend to prepare himself, that the news might be as bad as it could get. Waltrip finished his winner's interview minutes later with no idea how quickly the day was about to turn. Officials cut the session short and pulled him away before reporters could ask why. By the time the track lights came on, fans outside the speedway had already started gathering in small groups, waiting for a confirmation nobody wanted to hear. Inside the care center, doctors worked for close to an hour before the outcome became official. NASCAR's president delivered the announcement to the media that evening, and stock car racing lost the closest thing it had to an untouchable hero. His photograph would be on the cover of Time magazine within days, and the crash led front pages of newspapers that had never covered auto racing before. Schrader carried what he saw at that window into every interview for the next 2.5 decades, answering questions about the crash without ever describing the moment itself. Reporters tried for years to get him to fill in the details. He always steered the conversation somewhere safer, back toward the racing, back toward the stats, anywhere but that window. To understand why that silence went on so long, you have to go back to how two very different men from two very different places ended up closer than brothers. An unlikely friendship built in a garage. Schrader arrived in North Carolina in the 1980s chasing a Cup Series career, a driver from Missouri with no connection to the tight-knit racing families already dominating the sport. He was an outsider by every measure that mattered in that world. Somehow, he and Earnhardt found each other fast anyway. They were building race shops within a few miles of each other near Mooresville at almost the same time, and the rivalry started before either building had a roof. Earnhardt bet Schrader his shop would be finished first. Schrader said his would beat it, no question. On a Monday morning after a race at Bristol, Earnhardt showed up at Schrader's place early, expecting to win the bet outright, only to find Schrader already there working before sunrise. Earnhardt was forced to admit his own shop was not finished. He had to drive on gravel just to reach it that morning. It became one of dozens of stories the two men carried for years. Small and specific, the kind of detail that only survives between people who actually like each other. Earnhardt's own shop eventually grew into the sprawling headquarters of Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, a facility so large that people around the garage started calling it the Garage Mahal. But in those early years, it was just two men racing each other to finish construction, needling each other about gravel roads, building something that had nothing to do with trophies or point standings. That closeness extended past the racetrack in ways nobody outside their circle was watching. Before Schrader even bought the land for his own property, Earnhardt rode along to look at it with him. He told Schrader exactly how to build a pond on it and where to place the dam, drawing on decades of country know-how. He promised to supply the fish once construction was finished. When the pond was ready, Schrader called to collect on the promise. The fish arrived the following week, delivered cash on delivery, a detail Schrader still brings up as proof that even Earnhardt's generosity came with a catch. The bet? That got out of hand. Not every story between them stayed that simple. At a car show in Detroit, Schrader and Earnhardt both fell for the same impractical purchase, an amphicar, a strange little vehicle built to drive on pavement and float on water with the flip of a switch. They left the show, got as far as the airport, and turned back around because neither one could let it go. Earnhardt handed over a cash down payment on the spot. Schrader called his own shop and had a cashier's check and a rollback truck sent up to collect it before anyone changed their mind. Once the car arrived, Earnhardt laid down one condition. Schrader was not to put it in the water without him there to see it happen. Schrader ignored him almost immediately and launched it alone the first chance he got. Earnhardt found out and was furious for exactly as long as it took him to move on to the next argument, which, fittingly, was about money. He never paid Schrader the rest of his half of the purchase. There was almost a sequel to that story. NASCAR's own president at the time owned a second amphicar along with a longtime series official, and for a while there was real, semi-serious talk of staging a race between the two amphibious vehicles on a lake inside the Daytona infield. It never happened, but the idea alone says something about who these men were away from the cameras, competitive about absolutely everything, even things that were never supposed to be raced in the first place. Two grown men who had already won championships and built million-dollar operations were still willing to argue over who launched a novelty car into a lake first. The friendship reached past both men, too. When Schrader's 10-year-old daughter joined the Earnhardt family on an extended trip aboard their yacht, she grew homesick almost immediately, missing home more than either father expected. It was Earnhardt, not her own dad, who pulled her onto his lap and talked her through it until she settled down and started enjoying herself. She never forgot it. Neither did Schrader. That kind of closeness is exactly why the version of the final race that circulated for years never sat right with him. The blocking story Schrader refuses to accept. For 2 decades, one explanation for Earnhardt's final laps became accepted as fact, repeated in documentaries and magazine retrospectives until it hardened into legend. The popular version says Earnhardt was running defense, holding back the pack so his son and his top driver could cruise to a 1-2 finish without any pressure from behind. It is a clean story. It fits the sentimental ending Everyone wanted to write for him. Schrader says it is wrong. He has been direct about it in a way few others close to Earnhardt ever have been. Waltrip and Earnhardt Jr. did not need protecting that day. Their cars were simply faster, and the finish was already decided before the final lap even began. Earnhardt was not blocking out of generosity toward his son or his driver. He was blocking because a third-place finish behind his own two cars still meant a strong points day for Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, and because losing position, even the cars he owned, was never something Earnhardt accepted easily. That distinction matters more than it looks. It reframes the final moment of his life away from a noble sacrifice and towards something raw, more familiar, and arguably more honest. A man who competed exactly the way he always had, right up until the last corner he ever drove. He was not chasing a storybook ending for his son. He was chasing the same thing he had chased for his entire career. One more spot, one more finish higher than the one before it. Schrader was there for the decision that put him on the outside line in the first place. The same line that left him with nowhere to go when Earnhardt's car came up the banking toward him. He has explained that move plainly, without any drama attached to it. The group had tried the inside line against Earnhardt too many times before and knew from experience it never worked. Going outside was not a gamble or a hero's choice. It was a lesson learned from years of racing against the same stubborn man. That lesson is exactly what put Schrader closest to the wall when everything went wrong in the final seconds. A sport forced a change overnight. The weeks after the crash turned into one of the most intense periods of change American racing had ever seen. Investigators picked apart every detail, from the construction of the concrete wall itself to the way Earnhardt's seatbelt had failed during impact. A public fight broke out between the racing team and the belt's manufacturer, each side pointing at the other. The pressure became so severe that the founder of the safety equipment company stepped down under the weight of it, hounded by fans convinced he alone was responsible. Independent reviews later found that Earnhardt had a long-standing habit of adjusting his belt for comfort in a way that may have quietly reduced how well they performed in a direct hit. He had also resisted newer head and neck safety devices for years, considering them a hindrance to his driving rather than protection worth the discomfort. Plenty of drivers around him felt the same way at the time. Discomfort behind the wheel was treated as a fair trade for feel and control, and almost nobody questioned that trade out loud until it was too late to matter for the one driver who needed it most. The combination of an aging belt setup and no head restraint turned a crash that looked survivable on television into something the sport had never fully reckoned with. NASCAR eventually released an exhaustive investigative report running past 500 pages, tracing the physics of the crash down to fractions of a second and dozens of contributing factors. Out of that report came sweeping changes that reshaped the sport within just a few years. Energy-absorbing walls installed at every major track, a completely redesigned safety chassis for the cars themselves, and a head and neck restraint that quickly became mandatory equipment for every single driver on pit road. Schrader watched all of it unfold from the inside, still racing every weekend, still competing against the same field, carrying a memory none of his rivals shared with him. Asked years later how strange the aftermath felt, he compared the public reaction to the death of Elvis Presley, an entire culture in shock, disbelieving that someone that large could actually be gone. And yet the following week, the series loaded up at haulers and raced again at Rockingham, because that is simply what the sport does. Nothing, he has said, ever felt quite the same again after that day. Every one of those safety changes almost certainly saved lives in the years that followed, drivers walking away from impacts that would have ended careers, or worse, under the old equipment. Schrader rarely gets credit in that part of the story, since none of the changes were his idea and none of the technology carries his name. But he lived through the exact crash that forced the sport's hand, close enough to feel it, and he kept racing through every version of the car that came after it, a quiet kind of continuity that outsiders rarely notice. 25 years later, the silence finally breaks. In 2026, as the sport marked 25 years since that afternoon at Daytona, with a new documentary and a wave of retrospectives, Schrader turned 69 and did something he had avoided for most of his adult life. He sat for extended interviews, including conversations tied to the Earnhardt family's own media outlets, and spoke at length about the friendship, the shop, the amphicar, and finally, carefully, about the crash itself. He still has not described, in graphic terms, exactly what he saw through that window on that afternoon. That restraint appears deliberate, not accidental, not something he simply forgot to mention. What is offered instead is everything around it. The decision to warn Walter before anyone else could, the reason he does not believe the blocking story that took hold for 25 years, the small domestic details of friendship that had nothing to do with fame or trophies. Piece by piece, those details do more to honor Earnhardt than a graphic account of his final seconds ever could. Dale Earnhardt Jr., for his part, has publicly credited Schrader with something close to a second, quieter kind of parenting in the years since the crash, calling him family in every way that matters without the blood relation. On one recent podcast appearance built around Jr.'s own memories of his father, the tribute to Schrader ran long enough that it stopped being a guest segment and started sounding like a thank you letter 25 years overdue. That bond says more about what Schrader carried than any single quote about the crash itself ever could. That may be the real shape of Schrader's 25-year silence. It was never about protecting a secret, so shocking it could not be spoken aloud. It was about protecting a family and a legacy from having its most painful moment reduced to a single sentence on a highlight reel. Schrader chose instead to let the friendship speak for the man, one gravel road, one stubborn fish delivery, one shared bad idea at a time, letting the small stuff carry the weight the crash never should have to carry alone. It is a strange kind of loyalty, choosing warmth over shock value for 25 straight years in a sport that usually rewards the opposite. The Intimidator's legacy still shapes the sport he left behind, referenced constantly by drivers who never even shared a garage with him and grew up watching his highlights instead. But the fullest portrait of who he actually was does not come from highlight reels or magazine covers or a single black car with a number on the door. It comes from a one man who stood closest to him at the very end, who bought a ridiculous car with him, argued with him about fish, and spent 25 years quietly deciding how much of that final moment the world actually deserved to know. If you had spent 2.5 decades holding back the hardest thing you ever witnessed, what would finally make you ready to say it out loud? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.